Daniel Hannan is with us, European Member of Parliament. Daniel, welcome back to the program. Thanks for being with us.
Nice to be back with you. Thank you.
Well, first of all, your perspective from where you are, and do you agree with me that my greatest fear in all of this is the emergence of an Islamic radical state?
Exactly. Nobody wants the emergence of any kind of anti-democratic or authoritarian regime. The question is what is happening now likely to lead to that? And here I think, good people can disagree, but my own view, Sean, is the West has made a mistake. We were so scared of the prospect of some of these Muslims taking over that we ended up propping up some terrible, terrible strongmen. I mean, really nasty dictatorships around the region. And we've ended up creating the very thing we were trying to avoid, because what happens, the only time I'm ever going to quote Lenin on your program, but Lenin had this great phrase about a rotten regime exporting its contradictions. There is a process whereby these vicious kleptocracies end up driving young men into the hands of the extremists. And how about this? I just discovered this quote the other day. How is this for somebody who I'm not always a big fan of, but he deserves kudos on this? This was George Bush II. Back in 2004, he said, "For too long, many nations, including my own, tolerated, even excused oppression in the Middle East in the name of stability. Oppression became common, but stability never arrived. We must take a different approach. We must help the reformers of the Middle East as they work for freedom and strive to build a community of peaceful democratic nations." You know what? I think he's, 5 years after the event, I think he's being vindicated.
Well, I think he's being vindicated, and I think that was his modus operandi throughout his entire presidency, and he never wavered. And but even still, if you look at, for example, the U.S. and the U.K.'s relationship with Egypt, for example, everybody has known that he is a dictator. Everybody's known that the people of Egypt are suffering. Everybody's known that he has flaws. But on the other hand, he did create some stability in the region, at least with the agreement that upheld for 30 years with Israel.
Yeah, but you know what? It was an agreement that was reached by a dictatorial regime. And a consequence, an almost direct and immediate consequence of that, is that Israel has become, in the view of most Israeli analysts, the most anti-Semitic society in the region, because there was never a peace between peoples. Now, I would much rather, if we're talking about Middle Eastern peace, I'm
not sure what do you mean? Can you just go over that again? I'm not sure what you mean by that.
What I mean is, a democracy can make a peace. Right? An elected government can win the argument and say, we are now putting aside our differences with this neighboring country. And the country, the electorate debates that, comes to a view and says, yeah, we've had enough. That's a different thing from a government that is seen as a puppet regime of somebody else imposing a peace which its own people have never gone through the mental process of accepting. And I think it is in Israel's long-term interest, I say this as a friend of Israel, I think it is in Israel's long-term interest to live next to regimes based on parliamentary democracy. And even if in the short term there is some question over the hardly affectionate, albeit cordial and correct relationship that they have with Egypt, in the long run, what is in Israel's interest is to have a neighbor which resembles Israel more, or resembles the West more, in the sense that it's a parliamentary system.
I get that, but based on your argument, if we take, for example, the 79 Iranian Revolution and Ayatollah Khomeini coming into power, and the resulting theocracy that exists, and oppression of people in the process, and the stoning to death of women, and Sharia law, and all that is associated with it, I mean, by your argument there that we should have abandoned the Shah, which was far better for the United States, world stability, than the regime that we have there now, which is now fomenting terror around the world.
Makes the point, doesn't it? I mean, the argument for backing the Shah was exactly the same as the argument for backing Mubarak, or indeed the argument for backing the Saudis, or the argument for backing that swine Karimov in Uzbekistan. People said, oh no, the alternative is a terrible fundamentalist state. Well, Sarah Palin might say, how's that working out for you? I mean, we ended up creating the thing that we were trying to avoid. Now, frankly, I think it is inconceivable that the Ayatollahs would win a free election in Iran today. I just think it is inconceivable that if there were a free and fair election, people
I think it's inconceivable, but
for a continuation of that regime.
But we saw what happened at the first sign of any democracy movement, and even the United States, frankly, had an opportunity to show solidarity with the young students that were uprising in Iran, and the president of the United States, Barack Obama, did not go in their direction. He said, no, if Ahmadinejad remains in power, I'll deal with them.
Yeah, you see, I think that is a very legitimate criticism, and it's a criticism you could make of a lot of the EU governments as well. I think we could be a lot more proactive backing the reformers and the Democrats around the Middle East, but we've got to then be consistent about this. If we're doing it in Iran, we should be doing it in Egypt. And, you know, the great thing, there was Margaret Thatcher's guru, the man, her John the Baptist, if you like, was a great figure called Keith Joseph, who later served as her education secretary. And he had this great phrase, which is, if you give people more responsibility, they behave more responsibly. Now, some of these outfits, like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, they thrive on persecution. They thrive on the mystique of repression. There's no way that they would win an outright majority, but let's say that out of the democratic revolution in Egypt came a government which contained an Islamic component as part of the coalition. Once that party had to start wheeling and dealing with all the compromises that attend on parliamentary politics, it would very quickly lose its appeal. The solution... The great thing is not whether to say, is this country ready for democracy? Democracy makes a country ready. Democracy improves a country.
I agree with all you're saying. Let me just tell you why I am concerned. And I think you have really hit the nerve in terms of the moral quandary that exists. And as I read debate among conservatives, even in this country now, about the right path to follow as we move forward, I'm hearing your argument and arguments on the other side. I'll predicate my comments. I agree the natural inclination of the human soul, their yearning is to be free. And when given that opportunity, they will thrive, and that would result in a better world, a freer world, a safer world, because as people pursue their own natural talents and interests and have some degree of prosperity, it's better for everybody. Here's the problem. If the ultimate problem that we're seeing in Yemen and Lebanon and Egypt and Tunisia and Jordan, and more specifically in Egypt right now, and is that the Muslim Brotherhood and its allies, if I'm right that they are the 21st century equivalent to say that what the Communist Party was to the 20th century, their very existence is a threat to democracy and individual liberty and women's rights and freedom of religion. The problem is, look how long it takes to end such tyranny. If we go back to the 1917 revolution in the Soviet Union.
Of course, that's the worry, that you get one man, one vote.
Okay, so and then now we can go back to the 1979 revolution in Iran, and right. Things have not changed. So in that sense, I think it makes... What
I would say to you, Sean, is if our own policy, and by ours I mean the West generally, has therefore failed in its own terms, because the net effect of backing some of these horrible regimes has been to turn the Muslim movements into the principal oppositions. They're quite sly, some of these secular Arab strongmen. They're quite clever at bidding for international sympathy by pretending that anyone who opposes their dictatorship is a fundamentalist. And the danger of that argument is that it eventually becomes self-fulfilling, that if you repeatedly tell a population that the only alternative to a horrible regime is radical Islam, then eventually people will start thinking, well, maybe there's something in it. If they're the only alternative to these bastards, maybe I should have a look at it. And so that's why, leave aside, if you like, the ethical argument for, as you said, as you neatly put it, the yearning for freedom in every human soul. Simply in terms of realpolitik, I think our policy has been a failure. In the Cold War, we had to back some unpleasant people. As FDR is supposed to have said about Somoza, he was a son of a bitch, but he was our son of a bitch. Well, the Cold War is over. We don't need to say that anymore. Now we can say, yeah, well, he may be our son of a bitch, but he's a son of a bitch. And we can do better.
Yeah, I guess the added urgency at this particular point, this moment in history, is that, if you look at a little country like Israel and look at, Lebanon and Syria and Egypt and Jordan and Yemen and all these countries that surround it, and you add nuclear proliferation to the equation and, Iranian influence and Hamas influence and Hezbollah influence and the Muslim Brotherhood and a desire for an Islamic caliphate and Sharia law and total oppression of literally the entire region. I just don't know if I don't accept the premise that we are to blame for we are to blame for propping up their destiny, because I think every human being has an obligation, if they yearn for freedom, to fight for freedom.
No, that's right. But I think we have hurt our own cause by.
There's some truth. Well, but what was our option, though? I mean, maybe everything's 20/20 hindsight. But if we didn't back the Shah, if we didn't back Mubarak, what would have? I guess we'll never know the answer.
Well, I think we can be a little bit more imaginative than this. I think that the surest way of killing Islamic fundamentalism, or indeed any other anti-democratic ideology, Soviet communism or anything else that we were talking about earlier, is to create a property-based liberal society where people have a stake in freedom and in free trade, in ownership arbitrated by courts, in the right to make choices politically. Very quickly, these fundamentalist outfits lose their appeal. You don't have examples of these fundamentalist organizations taking over successful secular countries. When they do best is when they're against a horrible repressive regime like the Shah's. If they do end up in government, as in Turkey, then they end up having to compromise with the status quo. They end up becoming very boring politicians like everybody else and having to operate within the parameters of a more or less secular state. So I think, you want to house train these guys, if you like, and that means giving them the same opportunity to make mistakes that every other politician has.
Yeah, well, where do we go from here? I guess, because we can argue this in principle, but I guess my greatest fear is knowing the Muslim Brotherhood, knowing one of the things that the advantage they have, if this was a genuine democratic revolt and movement towards freedom and democracy, which, by all accounts has to be, considering, 60% of the population is under 30. Of those, 90% can't find work. They're unemployed. A third of the country are illiterate. It's 90% Muslim. The average family person is living on less than $2 a day. I mean, so there's utter poverty, and so there's a natural inclination for a better life for people. But when you add the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamic extremists that have the weapons and the guns and the means and outside influence, Iran and elsewhere, I've got to imagine that the odds are in their favor. They win for the time being.
I wonder whether that's the case. I mean, we're talking about a slightly more complicated society than that. There is a substantial middle class in Egypt. There are newspapers, there are universities, there are institutions there that could make for a civic society. What there isn't, and what there hasn't been really ever in Egypt under independence, under the British Mandate or under the Ottomans, is functioning parliamentary institutions. And I think if we allowed those to develop and we gave our support to those things, we would quickly see Egypt becoming a much more herbivorous kind of place. The worst mistake we can make is to be on the losing side of this revolution. I mean, those guys in the streets, in Suez, in Aswan, in Cairo, they are not burning American or British flags. Their quarrel is not with us. It would be, I think, an epical mistake to make this our problem. You say that, but there's rampant condemnation of Israel. Muslim Brotherhood saying prepare for war with Israel. Anti-U.S. sentiment, which we have seen many examples of since this uprising has begun. So I think, and if you look at the recent Pew poll that came out, only 17% of the population sees America, for example, in a positive light. Right, but I'm surprised if America, and indeed the West more widely, is associated with all the things they don't like about the current tyranny.
Granted, but perception is hard to change. And, ultimately here what we want is a free democratic Egypt, Jordan, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, etc. But maybe I am far more pessimistic here than you, but I just see the influence is quite strong. Unfortunately, I believe radical extremism and that thought process is far more ingrained in society than I think most people want to admit.
Well, I mean, it has been when they've got the purity of opposition and martyrdom and repression. Your country is based around the idea that anybody is capable of living in a free democracy as long as the institutions are right. That you don't need a magical character in the people. If you get the institutions right and you have limited government, decentralization of power, the separation of powers and so on, that freedom follows from that, and freedom as a habit of thought follows from free institutions. And I think that's true.
Just stay right there, because I got to take a break, and I want to ask you, because ultimately I think we share the same value system that where we got ahead. in terms of where we would like to see this go. But I want your very specific prescription and how we can actually achieve that, because that would be the ultimate outcome for me and for the world. We'll take a quick break. Daniel Hannan is with us, European Member of Parliament. Remember, we've got this radical extremist who supports jihad, the Muslim Brotherhood, on Hannity tonight. You don't want to miss this interview tonight at 9 on Hannity. We'll continue.
Hannity Headline, a bite-sized version of the show that you can take with you everywhere you go. To sign up today for Hannity Headlines, go to Hannity.com.
What is the solution in Egypt? When we come back, we'll get Daniel Hannan's position on that, and you are a great American.
We know you never want to miss the Sean Hannity Show, and now you never have to. Just sign up for Hannity Headlines, a bite-sized version of the show that you can take with you on your laptop, your mobile phone, everywhere you go, even to your liberal in-laws' place in Vermont.
Yeah.
And after a few hours of that, you'll be glad you brought Sean along. To sign up today for Hannity Headlines, go to Hannity.com.
We continue now with Daniel Hannan, European Member of Parliament. We're talking about the situation in Egypt. I might have a slightly more pessimistic view than he does about the outcome of events that are still unfolding. But we do agree. And by the way, he wrote a terrific book, The New Road to Serfdom, a letter of warning to America. We share the same goal. I believe that natural inclination, as I said, of the human soul is to yearn for freedom. And I think the single best thing we could do for national security is to always encourage democratic movements in countries such as Egypt. I'm just not sure the outcome is going to be what we want in this particular case. And if I am wrong, I would be extraordinarily pleased with that. But I do see the influence of outside groups, the Muslim Brotherhood, as quite a very clear and present danger. The question is, how do we influence the outcome that we both desire? What is the best path to get there at this moment, knowing that we can't undo our support of Mubarak, etc.?
Sure. I mean, everyone is familiar with Churchill's aphorism about democracy being the worst system apart from all the others, right? Nobody is claiming that this is going to be problem-free. All options, man being fallen and our world being imperfect, are flawed, and there are going to be problems, whatever happens now. And some of those problems are going to be felt by neighboring countries, some of them are going to be felt by Israel. But we're dealing with, realistically, what is the least bad outcome? And the least bad outcome, it seems to me, is full democracy, even if you don't like the outcome of the first election. The cure for getting the wrong government has got to be in the hands of the Egyptian people themselves. You know, I think we sometimes misread the mood in these countries. Very few people, as you say, the yearning for freedom is a universal
it's innate
condition. Very few people want to grow up in a society where there are no more elections. You look in vain historically for a country that has voted enthusiastically for the end of the right to vote. Very few people want repression. Very few people want to be forbidden by law to dress in a particular way or made to grow a beard or whatever. Of course, you get some people who think that. But it is very, very unusual to see a movement like that winning in a free, open, pluralist, multi-party system. When a movement like that does well is when it is able to persuade its country that it is the only alternative to some terrible, terrible dictatorship. And that's why I say the thing the thing that will arrest the rise of let me put it another way. Where is the Muslim Brotherhood strongest? All of the countries where there is a dictatorship. It is weakest in the countries where there's a functioning democracy.
I know, but maybe we're just... I think we have the same goal here, but we're not... let me see if I can explain...
How do we get from here to there?
Let me see if I can explain this better. How do we then explain the history of Nazism and fascism, the rise of communism, totalitarianism, dictatorship? How do we, more recently, the Palestinians voting in a terror group, Hamas, as their leadership? In other words, I agree that inclination of human beings to be free is innate. I concede the point. I've been stating it myself. But then how do we explain, time after time, in the last 100 years of human history, that human beings have gone along with fanaticism in one shape, matter, or form, resulting in the last century over 100 million people dying.
Right. It does happen, and it usually happens in some extreme circumstance, such as defeat in war, terrible economic collapse. The Russian Revolution happened in a country that was fully mobilized and fighting a massive war. It didn't happen. It didn't arise out of a multi-party pluralist system. There are one or two very isolated examples of communist parties winning elections. I think it happened in Cyprus a couple of years ago. But a communist party that's in a position to win an election, like the one in Cyprus, then is in no position to set about dismantling the whole system. And I think it's a similar thing with some of these Islamic movements. I'm not saying that there is no problem. Look, obviously there are some young men who have been driven, in extreme cases, to become bombers, gunmen, and terrorists, and that is a worry for everybody. That happens to some extent, of course, everywhere. In any society, you're bound to have a proportion of deranged young people. It's a sad medical fact that you're always going to have some violence. The question is, how do you minimize it? And it is not in our gift, either the US or Britain, or any kind of international coalition, to step in and say, this is the outcome which we would like, and now let's you Egyptians try and work towards it. I think our best bet is to say, you sort out your future, we're going to help, we're standing by as friends and allies, but we believe that there should be a full and free multi-party election without preconditions, and we will do our best to work in a spirit of friendship with whoever wins.
All right. Well,
we'd at least be putting them on the path. It's not going to be an easy.
Let me ask you this. Let's take a worst case scenario, and then I'll let you go. I've kept you longer than I said I would. But a worst case scenario is an Iranian-style regime emerges in a number of these countries. Maybe Egypt, maybe Jordan, maybe Yemen, and obviously Syria is a terrorist state now. What is this a 30, 50, 60, 70, 80-year process? And when you add nuclear proliferation, do we have time for this natural democratic yearning to emerge without some type of worldwide conflict? I mean, that's what I fear. I mean, we've been through two world wars, and in my mind, I think we're watching the emergence, potentially, and I hope I'm wrong, of a third.
I think democracy is an incredibly powerful thing when it gets going. I agree with Natan Sharansky, who wrote about this. He said, democracies don't go to war with each other. Democracies are peaceful neighbors. He was making an argument from an Israeli point of view against the policy of supporting these various strongmen. Let me put it like this, Sean. What is the solution to a regime like Iran? Most of us, I suppose, my guess is that you and I would agree on this. Most of us would say the solution to Iran, to this monstrous tyranny, these murderous ayatollahs who recently executed a young girl, is democratic revolution. We would be on the side of people in Iran taking to the streets and demanding majority rule. Now, having said that about Iran, how can we, in the name of honor or consistency, not back a similar process in Egypt? I mean, the democracy is the antidote to Islamic totalitarianism. It's not the midwife to it.
Yeah. All right, Daniel Hannan, I appreciate it. This is a very complicated time, and I hope and pray that this concludes in a way that will be beneficial for the world. But I got to run. Thank you so much for being with us.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you, my friend.
And by the way, your book is terrific, and it's A New Road to Serfdom, a letter of warning to America. And I was very pleased to be able to read the book and blurb it for you, and it's a great honor to have you back.